Welcome to the Lake Forest Podcast, a podcast about the lovely city of Lake Forest, featuring topics like local news, sports, music, people, food, and history. My name is Pete, and I'm joined by my co-host, Lake Forest history legend, Arthur Miller. We all live in Lake Forest. Before we start our class, we have a sponsor for the show, Dakota Insurance Group. They've got your back. Why? Because that's what friends are for. Dakota Insurance handles all your residential and commercial insurance needs. Get a quote now at dakotaInsuranceGroup.com. Okay, one of the goals of the podcast is for our listeners to learn just a little bit more about Lake Forest. Well, who better than to teach us about Lake Forest history than Lake Forest history legend Arthur Miller? Okay, everyone, take your seats. Hold your hands on top of the desk. Our class is about to begin. Hey, Art, how you doing? How you been?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Pete. How are you?
Oh, absolutely fantastic. Hey, are you the Art Miller that I just saw written about in Lake Forest Love today? Is that you?
Lake Forest Love. What's that?
Lake Forest Love. It was an article posted today talking about you. I'll put it in the notes of the show, Art. I'm
Oh,
throwing you a
great.
curveball.
Is this an X-rated thing or?
No. This is totally PG. This is David Sweet.
Oh, okay. David Sweet. Okay, he's a good guy.
Yeah, he's
Right.
a real good guy, and he did a nice piece on us. And you were mentioned. This art class is getting all around the world, Art. So what's this class going to be about? We walk around town.
Well, this
We
is
have our
about public art in Lake Forest.
okay.
And it's some of it's just straight history, things gradually build up over time and you see things and they're in conversation sometimes with each other when they appear, and they can even hinge on the controversial. You wouldn't think that artworks in Lake Forest would be controversial, but I'm going to get to some of that. So
All right.
let's see how it goes. And you jump in if you want to add controversy or you have anything.
Oh no, I had enough of controversy as it is. My eyes are wide open, ears are even wider.
Okay, so I'm going to start with talking about Market Square, which everybody knows about. I was reading another book about architecture today, and they just mentioned Market Square in passing in a book, so it's always mentioned and stuff all over. But Shaw planned it from 1912 to 1915. Then he built it in 1916, and he finished up in 1917 some of the details. One detail was the fountain in Market Square. Another detail was the drugstore that works between the three-story Walgreens building that's on Deerpath and Western. It's 3 full stories. And then his Market Square was 2 stories. So he didn't want to look like, you ran a semi up to the back of something and parked it. He works on it so that it would be, it would gradually transition. So the store for the Kraft building, which is in between the two, is 2.5 stories. And there's a mansard roof on the top story. So he did that. He wanted everything to blend in. If you look along over the doors and windows on some of the Market Square shops, you'll see, especially on the south building along Western Avenue, there are little squares over the doors and windows, and they all have little symbols in them. There's wreaths, Tudor roses, and fleur-de-lis or lilies that are embossed onto these little squares. Now, squares were a modern feature, but he made them medieval by putting these things in them. And where did he get the idea for the wreaths and the fleur-de-lis to be over those buildings? A half a block south, on the southwest corner of Deerpath and Western Avenue, is the Blackler building. That went up in 1895. And it has a bunch of copper features on it. You notice the green copper as you drive by. It kind of makes it look cool. And if you look closely at the copper, embossed into it are fleur-de-lis and wreaths. Now, wreaths were like laurel wreaths. They were celebratory kinds of things from ancient, goes clear back to the Greeks and everything, which you'd get if you ran a race, you'd get a laurel wreath. The fleur-de-lis were the symbol of France, and of course, a lot of high style. France was totally in 1895, and still in 1916 or 17, it was still very hot in that period as a style setter. So he was using those things. Tudor roses, that reflected kind of the Lake Forest Anglophilia. So the Tudors were important in this, the whole way that architecture took place in the English Renaissance, a lot of it. So the building is basic. The buildings at Market Square, the north and south, the long main buildings, are basically Tudor buildings. And then there's a classic Italian building on the west side looking into the park. So the three buildings there. So then, so that building was 1917, after the square had finished, that craft building. And also the fountain took a bunch of different shapes, and the area to the east of it took a bunch of different shapes in all the different plans. And as it got built, kind of 1917, it has, again, sort of little medallions all around the 8 sides of it, the fountain, or at least 7 of the sides, with sort of sea references. They're basically all sea references, crabs, which are also zodiac symbols, and ships. There's a ship. So you'll see crabs, etc. But turtle, there's a turtle there. So it's nautical, kind of reference to Lake Michigan too. Then over that west building I mentioned, at the top, in the center, there's an escutcheon, a thing, basically just kind of almost like a gable end that sticks up there. And it's got a shield in it with an oak tree, but around it, holding it up, are a couple of cornucopias. And cornucopias were symbols of plenty, but they referred to agricultural plenty. And so this was Market Square. So you had the ocean lake reference for meat market. You had vegetables there. You had references to selling things or commerce. All these, he had, in 1914, he had been the architect associated for the Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago. And that had all kinds of Christian symbolism from the medieval period. This is all secular symbolism from the medieval period. And so it's sort of an interesting contrast. Then the original plan in 1912 for Market Square had been that there would be 2 kind of interesting towers like the South Tower that we have now. But when he redid it, he raised the South Tower higher, and he redid it because he made the park longer than the original plan was. And he added the North Tower in a different contrasting style. The North Tower is not medieval or Tudor, but it's classic, later Renaissance English architecture. And so the classic tower has a sundial on it, which is an ancient symbol, goes way back to how they read things when the sun would be out, which we've had a lot of this summer. And then on the south side, they have a clock on the north face of the South Tower. Well, first off, you couldn't put a sundial on the north face of something because you wouldn't get any sunlight. You'd have to put a flashlight over it and move it around, you know. So that didn't work. So that's a clock, and that represents the medieval thing. So this, what it suggests is that Lake Forest Market Square developed like European town centers in different stages and reflected different styles. And so you get that in the art. Then, still not unfinished, he left it unfinished with 2 different things. One was over the fountain. He'd given a fountain to the Fourth Presbyterian Church himself because he was a parishioner. that had a big pier or square column in the middle of it. That was 1914, that had religious statues on it and everything, but he didn't put anything here. Holding up the bowl of the fountain are 4 eagles. Now, he kept this from the 1912 plan. Eagle is, the German word for eagle is Adler. And there was an architect, a young architect working for him named David Adler in 1912 when he did that plan. And so Adler designed kind of the idea of the fountain with those in it. And when he did it, he found Adler went on his own in 1913, but he kept the eagle signs in there with sort of blank shields on them. And there are blank shields around the square also that you could paint things on if you wanted to at different times. But he used that, he left that eagle symbolizing, using Adler symbolizing, because the medieval idea was that people that contributed to a building should somehow be expressed in it. And so he was using a medieval precedent for having an expression. So gargoyles on churches would have a face of one of the architects, you know, and stuff like that. And he had his own name, or initials at least, up on that escutcheon over the west building. So if you look around, you see all this really interesting combination of classic, medieval, and local art, because that he picks up those contextual things from that Blackler building of a few years earlier. So looking around Market Square, you can get a pretty good idea. You get a pretty interesting just art exhibit by looking around just at those various things. So that's one.
Okay.
And I was going to talk about also just briefly about Lake Forest College, a couple of things at Lake Forest College. At the corner of Deerpath and Sheridan Road, which most people can't avoid because you're going to the beach or something like that,
Yeah.
You pretty much have to drive by it. And you see a big red colored building, stone building there. That's Durand Institute. It was built in 1892. It's got some artwork on it that was done, you know, terracotta artwork. If you look at that closely, you'll see vines woven in the style of kind of William Morrissey style. But I was really going to focus on the 2 sculptures that are in the front of the building, in front of the parking lot to the west. On either side of the big sidewalk, there are sculptures. So on the south side of the sidewalk, there's an about probably 1980s, 1984, something like that, sculpture by Michael Croydon, who was a professor there. It was sculpted in memory of a staff member that was very much loved, and it's called The Wounded Angel. And it's now green, like that, the copper that's on the, it has a patina to it. And it's a traditional sculpture, postmodern traditional sculpture. Across the sidewalk to the north, there's a very interesting abstract modern sculpture by Richard Hunt, who is a well-known Chicago African-American artist, sculptor who's got a big shop on the south side, huge, looks like a factory studio where he crafts these big steel structures. And so there's this undulating steel forms woven together there. They're both low, so they don't interfere with your view of the building, but they're worth stopping and taking a look at sometime when you're on your way to the beach. They're good stuff. They deserve attention. Just to show the range of different kinds of sculptures that are in town. The inside the library, and I'm not quite sure how accessible that is now, but within the next year, it's going to be fully accessible. There's a really interesting small sculpture. It's a miniature sculpture of the 1887 Abraham Lincoln sculpture that is in Lincoln Park, right by the Chicago History Center Museum down there. If you walk down North Avenue a little bit, there's a beautiful niche that was built by, I think, by Stanford White from New York. And it's got this huge standing Lincoln sculpture. into the 20th century, even as modernism got going, that sculpture of Lincoln was considered to be maybe the most important American sculpture. It was by Augustus St. Gaudens, who was from, I think, up in New Hampshire. That's where, little town in New Hampshire. And there's a National Historic Site there now. But in 1907, his wife, after he died in 1907. And shortly after that, she made provision to allow some maquettes or some of these smaller castings in miniature scale to be done. There were maybe 20 of them altogether across the country. One is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They're in major museums. Lake Forest College Library has one of them, donated in 1921, 100 years ago this year, by J. Ogden Armour, whose estate was where Lake Forest Academy is now, the big house out there.
Yeah.
He donated it in 1921, and it's been in the college library ever since. It was in about 3 different positions over that time, or more maybe. But it's always there, and it's really probably of the public art in town. It might be the most important piece, and it's indoors. It isn't outdoors. The one that's at the St. Gaudens site, they have one there, the smaller versions, and it's outdoors, but it isn't outdoors here. And I forgot to mention, I said there was still one more detail about the Market Square things. The Shaw had a daughter who was going to be a sculptor, and he left the fountain, the place over the fountain, and a niche in the north building facing into the park on the 2nd floor level for her to put sculptures into. Well, she was a little slow on the follow through. Her father died in 1926. She raised kids, had a big career, sold stuff all over for the White House, in front of the State House in Boston, for instance. Well, she finally made something in the late 60s, or planned it anyway, did a maquette of it, posing with Mrs. Rob Lansing, Kitty Lansing, who's in town when she was a kid, holding another littler kid on her shoulder. And that sculpture is now in 1983, after actually Sylvia Shaw Judson, the daughter, died. It was put up by her family in that space. In the 60s, she wanted to put it up, and this is where public art can become controversial. There was controversy in town about the young people who were kind of up in arms and, hell no, we're not going to go, kind of during the war.
Yeah.
And so she was afraid to have that go in at that time. It just wouldn't have fit. It's really just a very nice family-friendly sculpture. It attracts kids to the fountain area. So fortunately, when 2000, when they redid the fountain, they made it shallow water so no kid can drown in it. But it's a magnet for kids to go over to that fountain in the summertime. And there's a teenager holding up a toddler, and it just symbolizes Lake Forest, Above on the north side, then the sculpture she put in is a tall, skinny one, kind of like the ones that her father had put in that 1914 sculpture or fountain down in the city. A tall, skinny kid, a boy ballet student. She'd been to visit some ballet students and African-American ballet students on the south side, and she watched him, and this guy just had the right angles and everything and all. So she did a sculpture of him, and then that was put in, I think, while she was still alive, about 1977. So she's a very important artist. One of her things showed up on the auction online with an estimate of $150,000. So she's not chopped liver.
No.
So so that kind of tops off the art that's in Market Square. It's a combination. It's a pretty good, if you go there and look around, it's like visiting an exhibit. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the library, the town library. And That's interesting. I said about controversy. So there was kind of an accident of plan. It wasn't planning. It just was a coincidence that the library in 1995, 26 years ago, was doing over the reference room of the library, which used to have like print indexes and things like that. And they were putting in computers because everything was going to go online for looking up books, where these things come out every year, with updates. It was easier to do online, infinitely easier to do online. So what they did was they remodeled that room just at the same time that they introduced a bunch of book-shaped sculptures by that same Michael Croydon, paid for by a bunch of his fans in Lake Forest, big name families. He ranged them along in front of in irregular intervals in front of along the hillside in front of the library. Well, people who know history and everything in Lake Forest thought it looked an awful lot like the Lee Mansion in Arlington Cemetery, which is the old Lee estate. And here were these tombstones put up there of books, because they're book shaped, in the same month that they put in the doggone computers and took away the books from the library. They had a bomb scare. Everybody went nuts. And what the Lake Forest Garden Club did was they hired another landscape architect, Rodney Robinson from Delaware, to reposition those book sculptures so they're not in a line, to look like tombstones. Yeah. And the kids love them. They play on them. If you've ever watched kids playing hide and seek along behind those things, kids will play on anything, but these are safe to play on. And, while somebody's reading books inside, the kids can play out front. You watch, there always is somebody there. So that was a big controversy. You didn't think that art in front of a library would be controversial, but it was just clash of cultures, at that particular moment in time, going from print for the first time in 500 years to something else. So if you go inside the library, there's three main kinds of public art to notice. The first thing is inside the rotunda. There are these fabulous murals that were done in 1931 by Nikolai Remesov, a Russian emigre, and he was working jobs. He tried to start a nightclub in New York. That didn't pan out during Prohibition. He came to Chicago, had a client in Chicago, and he started doing set design work, which is what he'd done in Russia, and did set design work for an opera company that they had at that time, and was doing this. And he did some work for the Women's Athletic Association in the city, which is a very chic Art Deco building downtown on Michigan Avenue. He was around for a while working with the Ballet Russe and stuff like that, but he ended up moving on to Hollywood. So from the late 30s into the 1960s, he was an art director and did set designs and things for shows from I can't think of the show right now, but Ocean's 11 was one of the last ones he did, but he did a Steinbeck one in the late 30s. And so in between he also did a lot of TV work for like Gunsmoke, a bunch of shows that people don't know now, but shows that were pretty prominent. They were probably really good jobs. And so he's a very prominent guy if you look him up. So that's an important the subject of the murals are ancient authors. And so in libraries from the late 19th century, there's always tried to be a balance of terror between letting people read whatever bestseller they want and trying to talk them into reading what they should read, which is the good stuff, which is like the Greek classics and stuff like that. So you got Homer up there on the wall. You got Cicero, Sappho, who was a poet. There's 8 different enormous panels of artwork there in that rotunda that's underneath the dome, and it's worth a trip alone, if nothing else. If you go to the left, once you're in that rotunda, you go into a room that has 10 big prints of Audubon birds. So around 1999, they were working on a book about the art at the Lake Forest Library. And they asked me to look over their draft. And I said, oh, this is pretty good. But why did you put down that those big pictures, those Audubon birds, why did you put down reproductions on them? And they said, well, this is a public library. And I said, this is a public library in Lake Forest. Give me a break. So I said, send one downtown to the guy who does, all the Audubon bird stuff. His name is Oppenheimer. And see what he says. Well, it turns out these were 10 original Havel double elephant folio original. They would start out as prints, but then there was another layer of painting that went on top of those. Maybe there are 200 and some copies ever made in the world, and they're valuable. And so they had them all restored. 9 of them are water birds, some of the biggest, most dramatic water birds. Not the eagle, but the golden eagle, not the American eagle, but the golden eagle is there. And there's one thing that's not a water bird, and that's a grouse. And so if it tells me the guy was a hunter, a bird hunter, who had collected these, and the library got them in the early 30s when, they weren't worth anything. If you tried to sell them, you wouldn't have got any money for them. Somebody donated them to the library and said, fine, Right. And now they're incredibly valuable. So again, that's another room. If you go and look at those birds, that's as good as anything you can see. It's incredible. So then if you go the other direction to the right, you go through the reference room, which has got a couple few plates, great big giant plates that were done when in Lake Forest from 1926 to 1931, they ran a summer school for the best graduates in architecture and landscape architecture. And they all came to Lake Forest to study in a kind of a contest atmosphere. They were going to compete to get year-long scholarships or fellowships to go and study in Europe, 2 in Europe, 2 in around the United States. The first year, a landscape architect and an architect, a pair won. The landscape architect was a woman. The architect was a man. And they said, well, we can't send you to Europe together. So they handled the problem by kicking the women out of the program. Those were the days.
Oh, man.
Can you imagine what that would make the New York Times today?
Oh.
That would be incredible. But they just had men after that.
Yeah,
They would send these guys off to travel across Europe. The ones who were the runners-up got to travel around the U.S. and did sketches and artwork on the East Coast in the early architecture and stuff that was over there. So those are really valuable. Some of those guys all went on after the 1930s. They were working on federal projects and stuff, and then did architecture, landscape architecture. One of the graduates for the program did Lincoln Center, for instance, in New York City. So, I mean, this was right at the center of, this was the center of where people were working right here. And the results of it are there at the public library. So Lake Forest College, Lake Forest Town Library, and Market Square. It's worth a visit to Lake Forest, if for nothing else but those. And you don't even have to wait for Le Colonial to open up. You can go to the Deerpath Inn and slum it if you want to.
You just got to keep your eyes open. That's all. Look around.
Well, there's really good stuff. And of course, people's kids are growing up here and they're seeing this stuff every day. And they begin to have an idea of what a town is supposed to look like. And parents can point this out to their kids as they go along. It isn't just big houses. It's not just stores and restaurants. Sure. We have just a great culture here. How's that?
Well, Art, I have pages and pages of notes that I scribbled down. I'll do my best to put my notes in the podcast. Please give them a once over. I'm going to try to find some of the
Okay.
pictures on there. I think I know what you were talking about, but remember, I'm only 3 years in. I'm trying to learn pretty quick here. Art.
Well, you go to the beach, right? You go
Yeah,
by Lake
right.
Forest College.
Yeah.
You go to Market
Right.
Square.
Yeah. All right. I
Just-
say, hey, I think this is what Art was talking about. Click.
Yeah,
I'll put
right.
it up and you tell me if I'm right or wrong. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right. Thanks for making me smarter again on Lake Forest history.
Thank you.
Thanks
I
for-
really enjoyed it.
Okay. Thanks for listening to the Lake Forest podcast. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and smash that like button on Facebook, Instagram, and please follow us on Twitter. Let us know what you'd like to hear about any upcoming shows. Again, I'm Pete and can be reached at pete@lakeforestpodcast.com. The link will be in the podcast notes below. On behalf of my co-host, Arthur Miller, we thank you for listening. Our class is now over. Cue the band.